coordinator at the Mirowitz Center. And on behalf of the Mirowitz Center, I'm delighted to welcome all of you here today to join in this presentation by Russel Neiss, our very special guest. Russel is a Jewish educator, a technologist, and activist who has built critically acclaimed educational apps and experiences used by thousands of people every single day. His work has been featured in the New York Times, the Washington Post, NPR, the Atlantic, CNN, the Wall Street Journal, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, and many other media outlets. He began his career as an itinerant Jewish educator, traveling across the Deep South, and has worked in a variety of Jewish educational settings, including day schools, supplemental schools, museums, and archives. In 2017, he was selected by the Forward as one of the 50 most influential Jewish Americans. And very recently, he received the Covenant Award, which is truly one of the highest honors in the field of Jewish education available to an educator in this country. He currently serves as a senior product software engineer at Sefaria. He lives in St. Louis with his wife, Maharat Rory Pekanis, and their children. Russel, thank you so much for joining us and for doing your presentation with us today.
Thanks, Stephen. It's really a pleasure to do this. This is going to be a bit of a whirlwind class. We are going to study approximately 70 years of Jewish history, or 3 experiences over the span of 70 years of Jewish history in 3 short moments, in the course of an hour. And the course is basically on the history of Jewish boycotts. It was inspired by, as many of you know, just this year, the state of Missouri passed an anti-BDS legislation bill to focus on activists who want to boycott the state of Israel. And many of the activists who promoted that particular state law and others nationwide began speaking in the context of boycotts being immoral stam. And like, again, I'm not a supporter of the BDS movement. I believe that folks who advocate for BDS are harmful to the state of Israel. But this as a Jewish educator and as someone who understands Jewish history, this didn't sit right with me. I recognized that it wasn't actually completely accurate, and I thought that this would be a fun opportunity to really delve into some of the history of how Jews have boycotted, when Jews have boycotted, how that's changed over the years, and our approach even to a Jewish community from, nowadays actively advocating against boycotts in many settings, to our earliest attempts when we were the ones who were in the street literally breaking windows and throwing firebombs, but we'll get to that shortly. So that said, I'm happy to take questions in the chat, I think, at any moment. I know I speak quickly, so do forgive me. I'm an ex-New Yorker and I haven't been able to shake that part of it. But we're just gonna begin right at the start and sort of move forward. So to begin, I'm just gonna share my screen here for a moment, forgive me. I wanna bring you back to the year 1903. And the year 1903 in New York City on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. You often see, street shop images. Sort of this is what you sort of imagine when you think of the Lower East Side often. And what happened was in May, 1902. In May of 1902, this is the very end of the Gilded Age. You have the robber barons who are still, by and large, running the meat trusts. In May of 1902, the cost of kosher meat, right, per pound, the cost of kosher meat jumped from 12 cents a pound to 18 cents a pound. And what happened was there were a number of Lower East Side butchers who realized that their to boycott against this meat trust. Basically 1,500 different meat dealers, butchers essentially, said, we're not going to pay these prices. We are going to quit selling the kosher meat. And this began on May 12th. 5 days later, they gave up. 5 days later, they gave up. But that wasn't the end of the story, because what happened was on May 16th, as you can see right over here in this picture, a group of a group of mostly Jewish women, as you can see from the photo, but also men and children, began to protest, to boycott. They called for a boycott of not only the kosher meat markets, but began to insist that this boycott be mandated by the entire community. So, for example, if you notice the picture over here, you'll see, again, standard Lower East Side pictures. You see a little shmata shop over here on the right. You see, kosher butcher over here, another wholesale cheese dealer over here, another kosher butcher over here. But the piece that I want to focus in on, and why you see the little police officer sort of hanging out over here, is if you notice the kosher butcher store right over here, way in close, you can see that the window has been broken. And the window was broken because this was a butcher shop that was not maintaining the boycott, right? So what happened was we have a bunch of these Jewish women who not only by their own just say, I'm going to exercise my economic authority to not buy meat, but they take it upon themselves to ensure that no one else had the opportunity to do so otherwise, right? So by the local press, one of my favorite one of my favorite stories of the local press at this particular moment is the way in which the local press depicted these women. Excuse me. And just some quotes from the news media at the time, because they are magical and exceptional. Sorry, excuse me again. So here we are, right? So on May 17th, the women began standing up, loudly demanding prices. As one such activist, Miss Levy, the wife of a cloakmaker, shouted, "This is their strike of the butchers. Look at the good it has brought. Now, if we women made a strike, then it would be a strike." Gathering the support of the bloc, Miss Levy and Miss Sarah Adelson called a mass meeting to spread the word of the planned boycott. It ended up receiving 20,000 Jews of the Lower East Side. And the next day, after a neighborhood canvass staged by the organizing committees, thousands of women streamed out through the streets of the Lower East Side, breaking into butcher shops, flinging meat onto the streets, and declaring the boycott. Women were the ringleaders at all hours. Customers who tried to carry their purchased meat from the butcher shops were forced to drop it. Within half an hour, the Forward reported, the strike had spread from one block through the entire area. 20,000 people were reported to have massed in front of the New Irving Hall. About 70 women and 15 men were arrested on charges of disorderly conduct. And this went on for approximately 3 weeks. This boycott, with a number of stories of women attacking other women, women lighting meat on fire and throwing it into butcher shops to watch them burn down. And really the most radical of radical street protests that you would see. Those of you who watched the news from the recent protests around the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota, and hearing calls for quote unquote peaceful protests versus protests that engaged into let's call it violence and to destruction. These women of the Lower East Side were engaged in violent protests. In protests that destroyed property, in protests that got police sent to hospitals, in protests that caused physical and property damage of all kinds. And to be blunt, right, excuse me, to be blunt, the powers that be at the time did not particularly appreciate that, understandably and obviously so. Right, so for example, the New York Times at the time referred to the women thusly, excuse me, quote, "This class of people who are engaged in this matter have very many elements of a dangerous class. They are very ignorant. They do not understand the duties or the rights of Americans. They have no inbred or acquired respect for the law and order as the basis of life of the society they have come to. Resistance to authority does not seem to them necessarily wrong, only risky. And if it ceases to be risky, the restraint it can have on their passions is very small. It practically disappears. The instant they take the law into their own hands, the instant they begin the destruction of property and assail peaceable citizens and the police, they should be handled in a way that they can understand and they cannot forget. Let the blow fall instantly and effectively." which I just love and adore because it speaks to, I think, right, a vision of Jewish women that we don't often think about. It speaks to a vision of Jewish protesters and our Jewish ancestors that we don't always think about, right? This is one of the smaller protesters early on. Notice you could tell by the various hats, all of the men in the back, some children, and notice this protest was, again, women led at the front. And it's just a fascinating social movement in particular to watch sort of the most alienated members of society, right? New Jewish immigrants, women primarily, leading a social movement protest. I'm sorry, I realize I'm not sharing my screen. I want to share this particular photo. Or am I? No, I'm not. Here's a photo of some of the crowds. You notice basically men exclusively in the crowd, women's up at the front. And to me, again, this story is powerful in the sense that it shows the power not only of Jewish activism, I should say, right? After 3 weeks of time, what managed to happen? After 3 weeks of time, this protest spawned from first the Lower East Side to then the Upper West Side to the Bronx to Brooklyn to Cincinnati, which was the outskirts of the Jewish community at the time, to Baltimore and across the country, until finally, you can see here the forward for those of us who read Yiddish. We have bravo, bravo, Yiddish Weiber, bravo, bravo, Jewish women. Basically what ended up happening is the women won, right? What ended up happening is the price of kosher meat was lowered back again from 18 cents, not to the 12 cents that it was, but to 14 cents. The boycott was ended successfully. And we have a moment in time where we have our sort of first example of this Jewish boycott, right? An example where we see violence being deployed for political means, in addition to with economic support, and being deployed very effectively to fulfill, in this case, right, both a spiritual and an economic need of these people. So, situation one, just point in time number one. I'm gonna fast forward briefly to 1933. 1933, January 1933, Hitler's elected Chancellor of Germany. We instantly, in that particular moment, see the first snippets of world boycotts happening. And these world boycotts happen, although they're not universally accepted. And part of the challenge for this is, right, if you think of the situation that we're in, we have in the early 1902, right, in 1902, we have a bunch of mostly Jewish immigrants living in what's ostensibly a democratic nation. They have the ability to fight for their rights ostensibly in a way that is universal. 1933, we have, again, this is the earliest days of the Nazi regime. We do not have systematic murder happening against the Jews yet. We have sporadic instances of violence beginning. We don't even have Kristallnacht yet, which begins in 1939. So we have basically Hitler with his anti-Semitism and his party that is advocating anti-Semitic practices, but has not really acted yet on what we all know is to come. So let's just set the stage, because it's often difficult in hindsight, particularly talking about the Holocaust, to talk about some of these issues, but I just want to set the stage here, right? Nobody knows in 1933 what's coming. Nobody expects it. Even in, many of the Jews who end up fleeing Germany don't flee immediately in January of 1933. They do so in 35, 36, following the Nuremberg laws, when things begin to get more bad. But we have immediately, beginning in 1933, calls for a boycott to begin within Nazi Germany. And these boycotts start in Europe. They start primarily in England, amongst some of the Jewish bakers who are there. They basically say, we don't want to let anyone in England use any German flour. They continue to basically spread throughout other parts of Europe. Basically, and they're started primarily by individual Jews, right? Again, so in 1903, 1902, we have this product being started by individual Jews. Most of the Jewish organizations, Jewish women, the most downtrodden and, economically focused, the most downtrodden and least powerful folks. By 1933, the folks who are engaging in this boycott are mostly small Jewish business leaders, at least at the start. Right, we've got some of the bakers in Britain, we've got the diamond dealers in Antwerp, and a bunch of Jewish merchants across the country, across the world, begin to sort of exercise independent authority. And this begins to happen particularly within to basically advocating for doctors not to buy German medicines, for lawyers to decline German briefs, to basically try to force a change within the government in terms of their anti-Jewish behavior. What happens is by March, the organized German Jewish community is publicly against these boycotts. The obvious reason being, right, you want to be a little quieter, you don't want to make too much noise, you don't want to get blamed for things you don't want to necessarily get blamed for. So there's a moment of caution here, right? So we have individual Jews basically saying, we want to boycott, and we have the organized Jewish community, at least in Germany, basically saying, maybe not so much. And around the rest of the world, you have that spirit reflected, basically. Do we support this boycott because we think it will change Germany's behavior, or do we not engage in this behavior because we think it will make stuff worse for the Jews? So you have things, for example, this comes to a peak by and large, basically, come May time. So by May, sorry, I'm going to share my screen again. This is a page in what is the forerunner to the Jewish Telegraph Agency, which is, for those of you who get the Jewish Light, many of the articles are from the JTA. This is the Jewy Daily Bulletin, which is, again, the forerunner to it. This is a full-page, debate happening amongst two of the larger rabbis at the time, right? Two Jewish commuters at the time. One is Rabbi Leonard Fram, who was a Detroit rabbi, and one is Philip Slomitz, who was, I don't recall who he was in the moment. But basically, you see it sort of spanned here, just in the nature of the structure, right? Should we organize a boycott of German goods? Yes, Hitler only recognizes force. Or no, right, this isn't really for Jews. This isn't the kind of thing that we engage with. This is bad for us. And so this is the world that happens, right? So this begins to move forward. This begins to move forward a little bit more. In July, the Board of Jewish Deputies in Britain, they decide against sponsoring the boycott, right? So again, we have early on the bakers and the Jewish street in Britain basically saying, we want a boycott, we want to support our fellow Jewish brethren, and the Jewish organizations of the time basically saying, not such a smart idea. And so this continues, right, and to the point where in America, come August, right, the Jewish American organizations begin to come in. The American Jewish Congress votes unanimously by emergency session to basically engage in a national boycott, and specifically to get other allies involved in it. Whereas the American Jewish Committee, which still exists today, basically says, nope, we're not going to engage in a boycott at all. We think it's harmful to the Jews. This isn't going to do anything. So this is sort of the setting that they find themselves in. There's a moment in the community of it's not unified, to put it bluntly, right? The community is not unified, and to the point in which, well, here, I'm going to bring up the article because I love this article, because if we look at it with our contemporary lens, we immediately misunderstand it. So I'm going to pull it up. I'm going to give you all a moment to sort of read some of the headlines and try to understand what's actually going on there for a moment, because this is where it gets particularly interesting and messy, right? So again, this is the Jewish Daily Bulletin. And we have, this is September 3rd of 1933. Okay, and so here's the headline. So I'm going to pause for a moment. What's happening here? Feel free to chat in the box. I'm not sharing my screen. Somebody's got to tell me I'm not sharing my screen. Forgive me all. All right. So we have our headline. I know some people are on the phone. I'm going to read it. This is September 3rd, 1933. And the headline that goes across the entire banner of the paper: Zionists hit Palestinian deals with Germany. Right? So in our modern milieu, we may think, right, the evil Palestinians who are engaged in the everlasting Jew hatred are making a deal with the Nazi. That said, right, there were Arab Jews at the time. The Mufti of Jerusalem did form common cause with Hitler during World War II. But the Palestinians they're talking about here in this particular meeting, they're talking about Jews who live in Israel, Jews who live in Palestine at the time, because there is no Israel because it's 1933. There's no state of Israel because it's 1933. There's Eretz Israel. And what happens here is that in September of 1933, in August, in the end of August in 1933, the Anglo-Palestinian Bank, which is a bank that was based in Israel under British mandate, and run by the early Zionists, run by the early state Yishuv, makes a deal with the German Reich's Minister of Economics and the German Reich. And this deal is to basically, right, again, this is 1933. This is not knowing the harm and the pain that is coming. I just want to own this in advance, right? The deal basically allows for, because what happens is, right, Germany is not letting the Jews leave the country without basically expropriating their property, without taking their property. So if you had a business and you wanted to leave Germany, the Nazi regime would take all of your money before you would leave as an exit tax. And so basically, if you were to leave Germany, if you were able to find a country that would let you do so, because many did not want Jews at the time, you would not be able to take any of your economic wherewithal with you, right? And so what happens is the early state Yeshuvniks, the Zionists living in Israel, and the Nazi government make a deal that says basically, we're going to allow tens of thousands of Jews to leave Germany. And when they leave Germany, we're still going to expropriate their money and put it into a special bank. But if you go to Israel, you can get that money back by using the funds that we've expropriated from you to buy German goods, tractors, factory work, other sorts of things, right? To help build the state of Israel. And you get your money back this way, right? So it was good for the early state Zionists because they got money and equipment that they would not have otherwise had. Because let's be frank, my grandmother, Zikra Levracha, right? She left with her family Europe when they could to get to Shanghai, and went to pre-state Palestine when they had a chance to do so because they didn't like living in a refugee camp. But they came to America because unless you were ideologically driven to be a Zionist at that time, America was the golden Medina. You probably wanted to come there. So, right, the early Zionists end up getting a coup because they get some really knowledgeable German Jews. They get some additional funding happening that way. The German Jews who could not necessarily leave with their money get a benefit because they get to leave with at least a portion of their money. And the Nazi government gets the benefit because they're able to break the worldwide Jewish boycott, and the worldwide boycott, which by 1933 is beginning steam, and to basically ensure that they have money for their war effort going forward. Right. So very interesting, weird, challenging, lots of different social power political functions happening in this particular state in this particular moment. But what ends up happening, right, at the core in terms of like history of boycotts, right, the difference we have in this boycott as opposed to the 1902 kosher meat one, 1902 kosher meat one, generated by the citizens themselves, by the people, very effective, right? 1931 to 1933, international Jewish boycott of Nazi Germany, tried to be driven by the people, hindered in part by the Jewish organizations at the time, and ultimately undermined by Jewish communal, political entities within the Jewish state of Israel, advocating for their own distinct political needs, as opposed to Jews in America, let's say, or even Jews in Germany or Jews in Britain, right? It's easier, and again, by no fault of their own. I don't want to suggest in this case, right? It's a lot easier for you with a monolithic group of Jews of the Lower East Side to advocate on a small scale for a kosher meat boycott than it is to maintain a worldwide boycott of an entire nation based on lots of different political needs and desires of all the folks who are engaged in that particular boycott, right? The challenge of where morality bumps up against reality is, I think, a particularly challenging and was a particularly challenging one. I want to pause for questions, I think, right now before I launch into the third one, because I know that it's sort of gone very quickly, and I just want to focus attention and answer if there's any particular questions that we have that's happened so far, just in terms of facts or other things. I hear someone's unmuted. Go for it.
Share, or you could raise your hand. I don't see any at this time.
I'll keep going. I'm going to assume that means it's clear, or I'm so far out in the weeds that no one understands what's going on anymore. And with apologies if that's the case. So I'll jump to the last little boycott, basically, that I wanted to cover, which to me is again, so we had one in 1903, we jumped 30 years, 1902, I keep doing that, I'm not sure why. We started in 1902 with our kosher meat boycott of the Lower East Side. We jumped to 1930 with our effective meat boycott of the Lower East Side. We jumped to 1931 through 33 to look at the international boycott against the Nazis, which ultimately fails. And then we jump again to the year 1970. Excuse me. We jump to the year. Oh goodness. We jump to the year 1975. No, 1976. No, give me a moment. We jump to the year 1975. 1975. Right. So let's set the context again. 1975, we have the state of Israel obviously founded in 1948. We have the Six-Day War happening in 1967. Right. So we're talking now approximately, and we have the Yom Kippur War happening a few years earlier. Right. So we're having an opportunity where the Jewish state is has been in existence for some time already. The folks feel pretty good about its power after the Six-Day War in particular. We have, so the state itself is feeling pretty good on social footing. The Arab boycott, the international Arab boycott is ongoing, and so there's a challenge happening there on economic front there, but as by and large, the state of Israel is in a decent set of shape. They quote unquote lost their first war with the Yom Kippur War, although even that did not set back the country too much. It got rid of the sense of inevitability. Within America, we have lots of good, fun things happening. We have the rise of the Black Power movement. We have the rise of the rise in some ways of like a nascent American Jewish power movement happening. Right, this is a time in many ways of the Jewish Defense League and lots of other sort of activism happening from a Jewish perspective as well. And so you have in the Jewish community, you have a much more muscular, view of themselves. Right, this is the community, the American Jewish Committee, which, as you remember, in the 1930s said, we need to shah still, we need to be quiet, we can't potentially speak out too loudly because we might alienate our brethren in Germany, or, by the way, also simultaneously, 1933 in America is at a time when American Jews are not so hot. Right, American Jews are still. We have Father Coughlin on the radio in the early 1930s, talking about the Jews again being problematic and not being willing to assimilate, and all the anti-Semitism happening in that particular context. So, right, so as much as the American Jewish Committee was basically like, we're gonna be quiet because of really our brethren in Germany, it's also saying something about how they saw the role of American Jews in America in that particular moment. That is, they needed to basically watch their own back. Here we have 1975, not so much the same kind of way anymore, right? We have an American Jewish community that has, is certainly not our Lower East Side versions of ourselves in 1902, right? We are economically, by and large, self-sufficient. We are in the suburbs. We have built ourselves giant shuls and JCCs. And again, not to say that there isn't pockets of Jewish poverty throughout the place, but our communities are self-sustained. Our communities are ingrained in America. We are part of American culture. In fact, the biggest threat facing American Jews, if you read literature in that particular moment, talks about the threat of assimilation, right? The idea that the most important threat to us is not because we've been so successful in America, our biggest threat is that we might become too American. And so this is the situation we find ourselves in. In terms of world affairs, we have, like I said before, the Arab countries having failed to defeat Israel in a series of wars, both the War of Independence and then the 67, the Six-Day War, and then the Yom Kippur War, begins to try an alternative approach to meeting their needs, and they begin to use the United Nations, and particularly the United Nations General Assembly, to use soft power, essentially, to engage in political attacks against the Jewish state, right? To delegitimize the state of Israel. We want to use that language. I think that's fair. In particular, and this all leads up, goes on for several years, and it leads up to the passage of United Nations General Assembly Resolution 3379, which is more commonly known as the Zionism is Racism Resolution. So this is the resolution in 1975 that basically creates the lie, I'll say it flat out, right? Creates the lie that Zionism is racism. It is a lie that you see repeated today in all sorts of circles. And in part, right, it's underlined by a nugget of truth, right? That is that Jews have the right to move to the state of Israel and get citizenship immediately, but nobody else does. But it ignores the fact that other countries, right, also have their own rules for nationality that are based on national return and national heritage. So this gets tucked into a UN resolution. The UN resolution passes, the General Assembly resolution passes overwhelmingly. There are 72 folks who vote for it. There are 35 folks who vote against it, and 32 abstained, right? So this is not like a close call, so to speak, right? And one of the countries that votes against it, is the country of Mexico. Now, it is still unclear to me this day, even after researching it for some time, why Mexico gets the brunt of this boycott happening immediately afterward. But basically, shortly thereafter, literally within a week or two of this boycott being passed, of this Zionism is racism resolution being passed, a grassroots boycott again begins at the local level, of basically Jews by themselves initially canceling their travel to Mexico. Because again, at the time, we were Jews. It's 1970s. We have some disposable income, maybe not enough to go for a trip to Paris, but we can head to Cancun. Not a problem, right? And it just so happens that particularly, again, in this moment where this is the 1970s into the 80s, into the 90s, even today, right? The Federation, I'll pick on the Federation slightly, not to be mean about it, but just to pick on them, right? The Federation runs trips to Israel that serve both as a fundraiser for the Federation, but also fulfill their mission, right? These junkets, so to speak. These junkets were all the rage of Jewish organizations, not just to Israel in the 70s, but to any country you wanted to, right? You see them sometimes in heritage tours to Poland, you see them in heritage tours to, now into Sephardic lands into Spain. But at the time in the 70s, for whatever reason, right, the American Jewish Committee ran trips for 150,000 members in the year 1976. None of them to Mexico, as we'll get to in a second. I should say, none of them for a 3-month period to Mexico. So what happens is, and basically in 1975, this begins. It starts with a number of just, again, individual Jews. Starts with a number of individual Jews who begin to focus on it. Basically, apparently the New York Times reports that the Mexican embassy that its phone and its mailboxes from the embassy and their consulates across the nation were basically bombarded with phone calls and with emails. The B'nai B'rith, right, at the time, the ADL was under B'nai B'rith, the Anti-Defamation League's switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree, is how they basically described it. And thousands of folks demonstrated in front of the United Nations. And the thing was, though, the weird thing about this is that this was not an organized movement at first. Again, it was not an organized movement. It was very focused on the particular thing, and so much so that the Mexican government was really caught off guard and didn't quite know who to talk to about this, right? In the sense that, like, well, right, this is one of the funny things also in terms of like the Jewish street, like who represents us, right? Who represents us and our anger and is supposed to do it, right? And it's a very fascinating thing. Like, I personally don't feel represented by my Jewish national leadership sometimes. I think in part that's probably because I'm a millennial and the visions that I have may be different than other folks do, particularly those who hold positions of power who are twice my age. But fine, lahavdil. I think it's an interesting question. And so the Mexican government begins to freak out, calls up the only folks they know, basically, in the American Jewish Committee. And the American Jewish Committee this time does something very interesting, is they basically say, we are not going to run cover for you, like, until basically we know that these needs are demanded, that the things that we're asking for, this is what the street is asking for, this is what we need in this particular moment, and this is how we can help push it forward. And lo and behold, right, this boycott starts in, right, the UN resolution gets passed in November 10th, right? By December 17th, this boycott is over, right? So why is this thing so effective? This thing was effective primarily because, right, within a series, right, I think in part, right, you have a whole bunch of travel coming up over the December break, right? You have an airline industry at the time that allows you to cancel your tickets and rebook them, no true problem. You have hotels that don't make you pay until you get there anyway, right? And so what ends up happening is you have the economic reaction being incredibly swift. That is, overnight, Mexico's tourist industry is basically decimated. They basically, the head of tourism in Mexico says they thought they lost $150 million as a result of this boycott. And by the time a month is over, right, Mexico has said, we made a mistake. When it comes up for a vote again, we'll vote against it. Everyone is mollified. The American Jewish Committee and the various agencies say, we managed to talk to our friends in the Mexican government, and they made a mistake, and it won't be a problem again in the future, and so on and so forth. And lo and behold, right? What happens? It's not as if, UN Resolution 3379 is overturned immediately. In fact, it does not get overturned until, I believe, less than a dozen years ago. It's very recent that the resolution gets overturned. And so, right, it's one of these really interesting questions to me. On the one hand, right, like, what did we actually get here, right, in terms of effective boycotts? Yes, the boycott was effective in that we shamed Mexico into saying that they shouldn't do something again. It's not as if, by the way, they voted at the United Nations with any regularity for a pro-Israel cause shortly thereafterward. But we were able to declare victory in some ways, maybe a Pyrrhic victory, despite that fact. But we exercised our Jewish power, we won, and we had this sort of really interesting thing. And it's one of these fascinating things to me to sort of watch both, as I sort of started with, right, to watch arguments today around, is it okay to boycott Israel? Is it bad to boycott Israel? Should we be concerned about people who want to boycott Israel or not concerned about people who want to boycott Israel? I mean, one of the interesting things to me, I think, yes, the answer is we should be concerned about anyone who wants to do harm to the Jewish state. But how much effort and energy should our community devote to fighting to it? I think is an interesting and important question, right? I think so many of the times these battles nowadays, right? I think the kosher meat boycott is an example of a boycott par excellence. I think the failed Nazi boycott, had it had worked, would have been very interesting to see how that would have hurt Germany's war effort. At the same time, there are probably tens of thousands of German Jews who might not have been able to survive. So again, I don't want to make that Hobson's choice. But this 1975 boycott, in some ways, I think is the most interesting, not because of just in terms of like how we both declared success and how, I don't want to say meaningless it was. Like, feel free to argue with me, but how meaningless it was, right? We got an apology, is sort of what we got out of it, and we got to feel good about it. But again, it didn't really make, and maybe the Mexican government will be concerned before they cross the Jews again. But they didn't actually, and so it's an interesting question to me. So for me, it's like these things raise more questions for me than answers. But to sort of raise the point of when, right, here are three examples in our Jewish history, and three very different Jewish examples with three very different outcomes based on three different Jewish communities, even though they're all American. To see how we responded, when we responded, and what that says about us today in terms of how can that help inform the way in which we both respond to boycotts against us, right? Because that's essentially what the BDS boycott is today, and also how we engage in using our boycott power in the future, and how we use our political power in the future, quite frankly. So that is basically on one foot. This course initially was taught at Matovu as a series of 3 90-minute classes. So this is the really, really fast version of this. So forgive me if I went way too quickly over some of this or if some things were confusing, but we have about 15 minutes remaining to address any questions that were not clear, or to focus on other things, or to bring it in completely different directions, or to tell me what an anti-Semite I am, and go. I see Leanne Schneider with a hand raised. I don't know if anybody else does, so we'll go right there.
Russell, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I realize that the Mexican Jewish community is quite small, but do we know what their position and the impact on them was in the Mexican boycott?
Yes, thank you. I love this part. The Mexican Jewish community was not pleased. In part because they were the ones who owned a lot of these hotels that were getting cancellations. They were the ones who owned a lot of these tourist businesses. They were not particularly pleased. Now, again, they were not pleased with their own government for voting for the Zionism resolution, for voting for the Zionism is racism resolution. But they were not particularly pleased with this boycott from American Jews trying to, right, the American Jews who were feeling supportive of Israel, and I'll say maybe their own feelings, were not really taking into consideration the feelings of their world Jewish brethren, their other diaspora Jewish brethren living in Mexico. I can't see everyone's face, so I don't know how this normally works. I see.
So I'm not seeing anyone else at the time. Does anyone else have any questions? I can unmute. Wait, if you raise your hand, or I can unmute everyone and we can talk. I'm not seeing any questions at the moment.
Can you talk about the BDS movement now and how it started? What started the BDS movement now?
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about the BDS movement, although I don't really want to, because I think talking about the BDS movement gives it more power than it actually has. The truth is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, for those who have not heard about it, is a movement that has been started, again, it is actually not supported by the Palestinian Authority, who supports only a boycott of settlements in areas that they expect to be part of a Palestinian state. That is, for example, the settlement of Ariel. But this is the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement was started by a bunch of pro-Palestinian activists, international activists, some of whom who believe that they want a one-state solution from the Jordan to the Mediterranean. That is a single state solution, which many folks believe will lead to the destruction of Israel, whatever that means. There are other folks who advocate and follow the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, who just believe it as a way to pressure the Israeli government to engage in ending the occupation. The BDS movement itself, at least on paper, even as many of the activists who started it want a single Palestinian state, the BDS movement on paper does not advocate for an end to the does not advocate for a specific political solution. They want, quote unquote, an end to the occupation, and believe that through boycott, divestment, and sanctions actions, like the ones that were initiated against South Africa during the apartheid regime, that they can help bring about political control that way. I'm trying to be as straight and narrow as possible. There are those of you, I don't know if there are anyone on the left who may think I'm situating this too far to the right, and those on the right who may think I'm situating too far to the left. I'm trying to just the facts, ma'am. Forgive me, there's no way to do this when you talk about Israel, but I'm trying my best. So just the facts, ma'am. I appreciate the laughter from those of you there. Great. So that is sort of where the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement at least sort of exists on paper. If you talk to folks in the Israeli government, and if you talk to folks in the BDS movement themselves, honestly, they will tell you that it has not had very many successes, full stop, right? It has not had the $150 million of material that the Jewish community had against Mexico in 2 months. It has not had the impact of the international boycott of the Jews against Germany. It has not even had the impact against the kosher meat trust that a bunch of Jewish women in 1902 had. What ends up happening, I think, now this is me pontificating, I will put on my pontificating hat, the amount of attention that we give the BDS movement, particularly when we put it on our state legislative ballots, it ends up giving it an outsized influence and gives the folks who advocate for those causes more airtime, more ability to talk about the horrors that they see, like horrors in quote, the horrors of the Jewish state, as opposed to the work that we could be doing, talking about all the wonderful things that the Jewish state is involved in and all the wonderful things that Jews do, as opposed to having tried to defend against saying basically, oh, you shouldn't have the right to say these things about a country that's important to me because I think they're mean. So that was me being a lefty, forgive me. I'll take off that hat. If anyone else has what to say about the BDS movement and thinks I have mischaracterized it, please feel free to take over the Zoom at this moment. I will graciously appreciate it.
You think it has a big influence on college campuses?
I absolutely know for sure it does not have a big influence on college campuses. There is a researcher at Stanford in the Jewish Studies program, whose name I am blanking on right now. Jewish students overwhelmingly say that BDS is not a concern at all, full stop. It is very much a concern of Jewish communal organizations who want your fundraising dollars to convince you that it is a problem on college campuses, because if it is a problem on college campuses, they need to fight it. But honestly, like this is something that I've done. It's a hobby. One of my ridiculous hobbies. I have lots of ridiculous hobbies. One of my ridiculous hobbies is to watch how Facebook advertising dollars are spent by Jewish communal organizations and how their targeting works. And one of my favorite things to look at is to look at organizations who do campus activism on Israel and to see where those ads are actually targeted to. The vast majority of those campus activism political ads are targeted to the folks who this Mirowitz Zoom talk is talked to. It's not to 18 to 21-year-olds. You see those have like this much space, and then you see like 55 plus, and it's like this side. And so I do very much understand why there's a concern amongst many in our community that college students are facing a rash of anti-Semitism on campus through the BDS movement. And I can tell you, right, as a millennial, so granted, I'm now 15 years, I'm about 15 years out of university, so I can't speak necessarily to that 100%, but everyone I speak to in my cohort and younger, I mean, yes, if you are a Zionist activist on campus, if you are a pro-Israel activist on campus, this is your bread and butter, but it should be. That's what your job is supposed to be. You're supposed to come to battle and battle Palestinian activists who are doing the same thing. And by the way, like this happens within college campuses in general. The rough and tumble environment of college politics is hilarious and important and does not bear resemblance to the real world. I mean, for those who did campus activism, I think, I don't know, maybe it's different then, but the campus activism, and maybe it's different now, but the campus activism fights, I mean, I was a pro-Israel activist when I was on campus. And like I engaged in these battles also, but right, these battles were not consuming even most of the other kids that I hung out with at Hillel. I just want to be perfectly frank about that. And I think that most folks today, if you have grandkids or relatives or friends who have kids in college who say it, I'd say by and large they sort of be like, meh. But again, I'd love to hear alternatives if someone else on the call is of that college age group and wants to speak to that issue, or has college kids who have some other alternative.
Russell, I understand that some of the proponents of BDS are urging political candidates to boycott trips to Israel.
Yes, that is correct.
Could you comment on that?
Yeah, sure. So the most recent one of this, the Democratic Socialists of America chapter in New York City, got some press. They're the only ones who I know of who have actually, I think, advocated for this. The Democratic Socialists of America have advocated that they've advocated that these people should not go on trips on, right? So for example, the JCRC here in town and the Federation here in town runs trips for lawmakers and for other influentials. The JCRC ran a trip for a bunch of actually of Black Lives Matter activists and other clergy to go to Israel. And there's a movement within elements of the political left to try to hinder those things. Again, in the context of this boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the argument from Jewish leftists is basically right that if you go right, what the argument that I think honestly we should be making for those of us who are concerned both about the anti-democratic nature of the Israeli government that exists right now, right? You have Israelis in the streets right now, tens of thousands of them boycotting against their prime minister. You have the former head of the Shin Bet, which is the FBI in Israel, who basically, of the FBI in Israel, who literally chained himself to a barricade outside the prime minister's office last night, right? So this is not necessarily around Palestinian activism, but I think many of us on this call, even those of us who are lovers of Israel, can recognize the fact that the state does not live up to its democratic ideals all the time, right? Full stop. We can recognize that. And I think one of the interesting things and one of the challenging things that for us, those of us who do that, many of us have a knee-jerk reactionism, right? That this is a conversation that should happen internally, right? I can say this in the Mirowitz Center, but I can't say this to the outside folk, right? If I admit that Israel is wrong to people outside, that might be problematic, right? I think one of the most powerful things that we can do in this case to stop this issue of folks who are engaged in wanting to boycott Israel is basically to say, no, you know what? Let me introduce you to my Israeli leftist friends who are fighting against the government also. Yes, you know what? I don't think the state of Israel is 100% perfect in this way also. And I'm going to tell you about it also. And here's how you can fight and who you can help, right? I think all too often that we've had this knee-jerk reactionism where we're like, right, when, like, look, if someone is going to punch my brother, even if my brother is wrong, right? Like literally, if I go out to a bar and my brother's talking trash to somebody else in the bar and he gets into a bar fight, right? My first reaction is not to be like, Scott, you're being a jerk, right? It's to punch the other guy. That's what I'm going to do. I'm going to punch the other guy, right? Now, perhaps in earlier times, before that happens, right, I should dial it back and be like, Scott, you're being a jerk. We're leaving, right? Or Scott, back it up a little bit, right? Or even like get in the middle and apologize to the other guy and do something, right? Not a perfect metaphor, but lahavdil, right? We need to clean our own laundry here a little bit too. Yes, there are Sonei Israel. There are plenty of people who hate the state of Israel, full stop. Those people need to be fought on all terms 100% of the time and fought viciously and vociferously, right? And then there are lots of other people who are in the middle who want to like hear these other things and they don't hear, I think, enough from those voices of Jews on the left who or even those Jews on the right who see the state of Israel and see, you know what, you're not living up to the ideals that are in your own founding documents and in the ideals that we hold as American Jews. I didn't expect this to go.
My name is Stan. My name is Stan. Can you hear me?
I can.
Okay. First off, of course, I'm in the Mirowitz Center. I do apologize sincerely for coming on so late. I had signed up with Susan. I had a doctor's appointment that was changed, so here I am. I don't like when people come to a class whatever late. From what you just said, I believe that Jews or other minorities, there's enough people in the world that seem to hate them or against them, oppress them. And then when we have infighting, and like you're saying so well, excuse me, that the different opinions in Israel amongst themselves, that taking it too far, getting to a position, excuse me, where we're fighting, disagreeing, almost to hating each other, that's very, very detrimental. And I see your point of saying, you know, if the world is against you, you do want to come together. but still realizing that we're not perfect, but not to go over the deep end and become against each other as Jews or against Israel. I find that if we're unconditional loving within anyone or ourselves, we do it without any conditions. You don't have to meet my expectations for me to support you or love you, also under all conditions. So if some of the things in Israel are not what we would hope, what we would want or expect, we still stick together, but try and compromise and work together on that.
Oh, 100%, right? 100%, right? Like, but right, I'm gonna push back slightly. I love my children unconditionally, right? I love my children unconditionally. That doesn't mean if I like wake up and I find that the chocolate cake that I baked for like Shabbos dessert has like been eaten handful by handful by handful, that I'm not gonna get angry about that, and that I'm not gonna speak out against that and try to, adjust that behavior. Now, again, it's different. We are not Israel's parents. They are not our parents, right? At the same time, right, there's unconditional love and unconditional brethren doesn't mean that we need to, bite our tongue when we think something is wrong. But I hear.
We work to improve it, and instead of criticizing or putting up our fists, put out our hands in acceptance and take hold of each other.
Yeah, I think criticism is an important part in that, right? If you can't acknowledge there's a problem, and maybe it is internally first, right? But if you can't acknowledge that there's a problem, or by the way, if you acknowledge the problem exists for years and years and years and years and years, look, I'm still waiting. I'm an Orthodox Jew, right? I'm an Orthodox Jew. I can daven at the kotel in the way in which I want to daven at the kotel. I know there are lots of other folks in my community, right? I'm the minority. Most other American Jews are not Orthodox. Most other American Jews who want to daven at the kotel, the Western Wall, cannot. The Israeli government has promised a solution to this problem for more than a dozen years, and they still haven't done anything about it. We could talk out against that. Now, that's an easier thing than talking about Palestinian liberation, which is, again, a messier subject for lots of other reasons. But it's easy to talk about that, and I think it's challenging. But I don't think it should mean just because. I don't think we should feel the need to be silent because it might embarrass somebody. But again, I'm open. I appreciate the critique, and I respect them. I think it's a valid one for sure.
What do you think about this UA, the treaty that that Jared Kushner has made with?
I haven't read it yet, and to be perfectly frank, I have much more interesting and important things to do than to read some treaty that may not exist and all the various arms deals that will end up being from it. So I'm really not interested. I'm glad that Israel is able to make peace and normalize itself with its neighbors, and I wish that luck because that means goodness for everyone in the world. So that's all I got there.
Do you think that might cause an intifada?
I'm a Jewish educator by training. If you want to talk Talmud with me or American Jewish history, I'm much more about that than I am about political realities on the ground. I'm a historian by nature, and I'm a Jewish educator by nature, but I don't do political analysis. But wait till David Miskovsky comes back, and you should sign up for his talk whenever he's in town next. I think the JCRC is co-hosting something there, or maybe sometimes future. I think there was an email that went out about that. So I cannot help on that front. You're muted, Stephen, if you're trying to talk.
You may not necessarily be authority on all aspects of Israel's history, but you've given us a sweeping account of lots of very interesting stuff, in fact, for which we're very grateful. It's been interesting, it's been actually entertaining, and it's been really a treat to hear about so many different aspects of the boycott's story and different perspectives on it. I hope that we can invite you back on another occasion to give us another kind of presentation. On behalf of everybody who's on this Zoom call, I want to thank you for making your time available to us and for sharing your knowledge with us.
My pleasure. And can I stick around for like another 5 minutes if someone wants to think in smaller groups? If everyone else wants to jump off, I'll stick around for another 5 minutes or so. If someone was embarrassed to see something in a larger group and is willing to say it in the smaller, but otherwise go. Enjoy.
Thank you so much.
Spend time away from your screens. Go outside if you can.
Shalom.
Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Judith.
You're welcome. That was like a fun-filled, fast track.
It was, I don't know, I feel like maybe we should have focused just on one, but it's okay.
Yeah, it's okay. It was just, yeah, it was lots of information. So I think it was taking a little time for people to digest all the information.
I forget. I often say that my theory of education is take spaghetti, throw at wall, see what sticks, and then come back again afterward. But particularly here, where it's just most. I think these are three pieces of history that no one knows about, right? And that's just like, let me just introduce you to a taste of this. And like, you can go and research a little bit more if you're interested and curious. But let me give you a tom of this.
Yeah, yeah.
Hi, I thought this was very good. I'm curious if it's going to be available online for later viewing.
Yes, I have recorded it, and so as long as the recording is has actually taken, I will have it on our website, and we can send you an email with a link, or
That's
you
gonna
can visit our website, muirwoodcenter.org.
I'll say that's going to be
Thank you
incredibly.
very much. I've been enjoying these the series. Thank you.
It's going to be incredibly dangerous for me when someone, a year from now pulls something out of context.
Well, I mean, you can take a look and review it really
No,
quick.
it's fine. Whatever I said, it's out there in the world, and I've certainly said worse. I see Roe here. I've certainly said worse on Twitter and in print and other places. So it's fine.
Okay, good. And like I said, I am recording it, so I think actually I can stop the recording now.